So how much do you think about fitting in? The main reason we're reading Milgram this semester and reading a lot about Milgram was because Milgram's experiment set up a huge ethical quandary. And it started a real conversation about what is the right way to do research. What responsibility do researchers have to their subjects? Are scientists and people who have higher motives justified in doing whatever they can to learn about stuff that's important? But I want to take just a step back and think about some of the key issues that are still legitimate that Milgram was really interested in particular, conformity. Stanley Milgram was interested in how people are controlled and how control is used. Control, if we're looking for a definition, because those things never hurt, is how people are able to use power to get other people to do what they want. How can you use power to manipulate people to get certain behavior? And he is particularly interested in this stuff because this was post World War II. Germany was a highly educated country. It was also where Nazism came from, and lots of people found themselves going along with Nazism, even if it was something that probably wasn't in their past makeup. So, why do people do it? Why do people conform to whatever norm happens to come up? Well, let's talk a little bit about conformity. There are a few different types. There is compliance, where people will change their behavior without necessarily changing their opinion. There were undoubtedly people in Nazi Germany who went along with the Nazi Party even though they probably didn't believe it. For survival, maybe? Who knows? There's internalization when someone changes their behavior and their opinion. There were probably people who did not fall into the Nazi ideology who ended up becoming Nazi like, not only in their behavior, but what they thought as well. And then there are people who conform solely as a matter of identification, where you adopt the group's views because you value group membership. There were undoubtedly people who just wanted to belong to something. That is something that's human. But regardless of the type of conformity, conformity does end up being something very much tied to control. Conformity gets used. Now, different people can control you in different ways. You can be controlled by your rulers, not those rulers, these kind of rulers. And these kind of rulers can exert a certain amount of control because if you don't do what your rulers say, they can lock you up. You can be controlled by the military. And what can the military do to you if you don't do what they want? Well, they can invade you. They can probably do much worse things to you as well. You can be controlled by religious groups. And what can religion do to control you? Well, if you're not talking about a religion that's directly tied to the local government, they still have the ability to convince you that you're damned to hell. These are all types of control that are directly tied to oppression. But all control isn't necessarily do this or I'm going to step on you and squash you. There's another type of control that's a little bit more subtle. The specific term is called hegemony. Hegemony is something that comes from an Italian philosopher, and we could get into it, but the important thing is that the ideas of the ruling class, the people who are in control, don't have to necessarily be enforcing their ideas by dominating someone. They can just make their ideals and their beliefs come to be seen as the norm. Rich people can make the values of a society their own values. And if you convince everybody that this is the right way, you don't have to step on them. Cultural hegemony implies the dominance of one social group and its ideologies over the other one, but not necessarily through the direct use of force. Media is a way where people are controlled quite extensively. You have that one crazy uncle who watches the wrong cable news network and believes things that no human being should believe? Well, you've seen an example of that. That's an extreme example, but there are a lot more. Milgram was convinced that control was the direct result of how we interact with authority figures, and this is what his experiment ended up testing. And we're not going to go over the experiment here. You've gone over it in your readings. We've had discussions. There's the question of, was Milgram right about authority figures, and how Milgram ran an experiment, was it worth the kind of knowledge he got? Because there were, as the readings are going into depth, a little bit of a human cost here. Were the insights enough? Before we wrap this up, I want to also make clear, though, that all conformity isn't necessarily bad. There is a certain amount of comfort in conformity. If we conform, we belong, and people who conform to a group because they value the group membership, that is a legitimate way to act, and that is how lots of people do lots of things. Humans are a social creature, after all. We're not hunters and gatherers anymore. We gather together. We want to belong in groups. And there's some real practical benefits to conformity as well. I mean, can you imagine driving if nobody conformed to any of society's rules? That would be kind of ugly. Still, conformity isn't necessarily something that should be valued absolutely. Not everybody conforms. Sometimes that's the best decision. Whenever we're talking about conformity, it's also important to remember that it's something we really can't avoid. We're going to conform. We have to follow rules. We have to follow certain regulations. We have to follow certain ethical guidelines, and they might not be exactly what we personally would believe. But we work in groups, so these kind of things, they're required. Makes it all difficult, doesn't it? Afraid there aren't any simple answers when it comes to this, but that means it's just worth studying. That's what I always think anyway. Anyway, see you in the next video.